Israel, US, India, and the United Arab Emirates. Both groups are attempts to create a favorable balance of power. On the other hand, India has this old friendship with Russia and is buying oil like there's no tomorrow. So I know the foreign minister has tried to explain it as India has to look after its people, its economy, its national interests. Yet in the West, there is a lot of difficulty with that position.
Not really.
I was coming to that. We just had a G20 summit
Right.
where President Biden seemed to have, and the West in general, seemed to have climbed down a bit from their position. So this brings me to how has India managed to straddle the middle, to walk on this tightrope? Has it managed to educate the big powers on how to live with contradictions? Is it deft diplomacy? I mean, why are major powers willing to accommodate India?
Okay, well, there's a lot of things in what you've said that need to be unpacked. First, on the question of non-alignment and so on, as far back as my last years in the UN, I started talking about the world moving away from notions of non-alignment to those of multi-alignment. And I'm very pleased that though I floated that when I was a minister in the government, and didn't quite catch on at the time, subsequently it does seem to have begun to come into vogue, and Foreign Minister Jaishankar is using that word, and the first time he did so, he attributed it to me, so I'm very happy to take credit for it. What I meant by
Good for
that...
him that he attributed, remember to attribute it.
That's right, but let me explain what I meant and why I think it's exactly what's happening. We've moved away from the binary world of the Cold War era. We are in a world that is really much more like the World Wide Web, this networked world in which I'm connected to you, and then you're connected to him, but I'm not necessarily connected to him unless there's some other issues in which we need to be connected. We all have these multiple connections all over the place, and that, in a very simple way, gives us a world where multiple alignments are possible. Now, in India's case, for example, the paradoxes that Seema was hinting at include not just the one she's mentioned, but also, for example, the fact that we were a leading voice in the G77, which is sort of the global trade union of developing countries, as well as a key player in the G20, which is the management, as it were, of the world macroeconomy, that we were a loud voice in the non-aligned movement, railing against the colonial oppressors of the Western world, and now, at the same time as we were doing that, we were also a loud voice in the community of democracies, alongside the very Western countries that we were criticizing in the non-aligned movement. We've been fighting for some years now a permanent seat in the Security Council, but at the same time, we have an understandable focus on our immediate neighborhood with all the dangers and challenges that represent. So these paradoxes are widespread. And if you look at the way in which we've been trying to navigate this multi-aligned world, our foreign minister meets every year with his counterparts in Russia and China in something called RIC. Then he adds the Brazilians and South Africans to it, and he gets BRICS. Then he takes out the Russians and the Chinese, and he gets IPSA for South-South cooperation. And to that he adds China, but not Russia, and he gets BASIC for environmental negotiations. And these are all formulations in which India has a vital role to play, not merely because its name so conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every acronym, a vowel, at least until today. But also because obviously India has something to contribute to each of these groups and has something to gain from each. So that's the kind of multi-alignment that I see taking place in the world, and in that, yes, we do live with a lot of contradictions. Now, on the specific example of Russia, Ukraine, oil, and so on, frankly, I think the West, after their initial protestations, very quickly accepted what was going on for two reasons. I mean, the assumption always was that the West was tolerating this because India was indispensable in the larger, bigger picture against, as a counterweight against China, but it's much more than that. There are economic reasons as well. India buys a dramatically larger quantity of Russian oil and gas, but as a result, it keeps global oil prices stable. Because if India wasn't a customer for all of this Russian oil and gas, and that was taken off the market a sanctions were upheld everywhere. The remaining oil would have more people, including India, demanding for it, and the prices would go up. So all of us would be paying more at the pump, even in New York, if India wasn't buying Russian oil. That's one very important consideration which the West has realized. The second thing
So
people
why
don't
did
realize,
West-
wait, is that all this comes into India, is then refined and processed in India.
Right.
And you know who's been buying all the increased refined output? The
Europe.
US and the UK. Forget the European, the US too. So the fact is that there are contradictions also in the way in which the world has been reacting to all. But in many ways in diplomacy, it is considered a virtue to be acceptable to both sides of an equation. You can talk to both people. I certainly feel that at the appropriate time, India should leverage its decent relations with both sides to try and promote peace in this conflict. At the moment, I'm not sure the situation is ripe for peace right now. But certainly, India would be in a position to make more of a difference as a peacemaker, precisely because it hasn't burned its bridges with either side. That's the only good thing. I was a bit of a heretic in the Indian political space as the one Indian parliamentarian, in fact the only one in the debate in Parliament on Ukraine, who criticized the government's policy, and particularly its somewhat mealy-mouthed articulation of its policy initially at the UN. The articulation has improved considerably since then. And I had justified my reasons in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine about a year ago. So there's a lot there that I don't fully subscribe to, but I've understood why a year later the policy still holds good and why it's broadly consensual within India. It just needs to be put across in a way that's perhaps less belligerent or hostile to other countries and much more willing to accommodate everyone's concerns and point of view on this.
I think I would add to that the way the world has changed, especially geopolitically, that the West no longer dismisses a country like India and the global South anymore, like it once used to. The Americans used to just dismiss India as, oh, you're in the Soviet camp and you've nothing to add except to complain you're a giant headache in our head, and just go away somehow. Pakistan is so much better, easier, etc. But today, I see a real dramatic change. The West is actually listening to how India is articulating the needs and compulsions of the global South, which the war has exacerbated.
Absolutely. In fact, the war has affected countries far, far away. Many African countries have had a crisis when it comes to the rise in commodity prices, the difficulty of obtaining enough wheat, because Ukraine and Russia together used to account for 40% of the world's grain exports and wheat exports in particular. And given all of that,